We're going to cover three main areas. We're going to look at the different modes, see what's going on. We're going to look at global sourcing and how it's impacting us, and we're going to look at the domestic side. But before we get there, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, why do we care about transportation and logistics? I mean, who cares? Because it takes up our economy, and it touches everything you and I do, from everything we're wearing today to the pencils and pens you're using, everything. And as you can see, it's close to what we spend on healthcare, which obviously gets a lot of the news. The other thing is, UPS has recently ran a series of ads, which you've seen on TV, you've probably seen in some of your magazines. UPS, the old Big Brown, is obviously a big presence. You see their trucks everywhere. I think just the fact that UPS changed their whole focus and brand to logistics is going to get the general public to understand a little bit more about the term and start to understand that maybe there's something going on when I order my parts from Amazon or my books or whatever, and they don't show up on time. So I think that's going to be interesting for all of us. So let's talk about the modes. We know that during the recession, well, in fact, up to the recession, when the oil peaked back in 2008, we had many motor carriers, trucking companies, file for bankruptcy or go down. We had a lot of drivers leave the market, and of course the economy didn't help that whole game. And then the banks got hard and all that kind of stuff. If you look at the graphs here, especially the one on your right, you'll notice that the capacity in the number of power units, which is what it needs to pull the trailers, is way down for the big, well, in this case, it's almost the big 7 motor carriers in the country. That's an indication that capacity, they did good things during the recession to reduce capacity, so they're still here in most cases, but that means as the recession rebounds, they are not going to add back capacity as fast because they have to make up for some lost time, and that will impact pricing. The other thing that we're going to see is the driver shortage. How many of you here in this room are raising your children to be a truck driver? I get that same response even in industry audiences, and I'll bet if I asked how many of you are raising your children to be a railroad operator, I would see the same response, nobody. And that, I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying that is an issue that the country is facing, because as you can see, well, that I've circled in green, during 2004 to 2006, we were in desperate need as an industry for drivers and couldn't find them. I don't know if any of you realize that the industry can't touch a young person until they're at least 25 for insurance requirements. So what that means is there's a pool that comes out of high school that really doesn't belong in college, doesn't know what they want to do, would drive a truck, but they can't. So it's an issue, and it's an issue because it's going to impact pricing. The other thing is the federal government has new safety regulations that will rate all carriers. No one knows where that's going to take it. The shippers in the United States are extremely concerned. It's a good thing, but they're still concerned. The national news is even talking about it again recently, so that must mean it's a legitimate topic. And you might say, well, why are you harping on that we have less trucks and that we have less drivers? Because back when times were pretty good, when things were very good during 2004 to say 2006, even into 2007, we had a number of potential clients, and in case 2 of them converted into clients, who had rural or outstate manufacturing facilities and could not get trucks. So you can locate where it's traditionally cheaper to build a plant, where there's usually an available pool of labor, but if you can't get a truck to go up there, or you can't get rail service, which is another issue, you are stuck. And so that is something for you guys to think about, because it happened and it will happen again in the near future. And one of the reasons I harp on trucks is because they handle close to 70% of everything that gets moved. You got to remember, a truck handles everything that comes off a ship, off a train, off an intermodal, wherever. It doesn't matter. It's still, whether we like it or not, is touched by a truck. Now, one of the things that we're going to do throughout the presentation is I have slides like this that basically review what we just talked about. For the interest of time, it's in the presentation, and I'm going to skip them. Is that okay? All right, so we can keep moving. The railroads saw the same thing as the trucks. Capacity dropped with the recession. They parked equipment. They're just starting to bring it back online. In fact, I remember driving down, I think it was a year ago, going through Albertville on 94, and on the right, on the west side of the freeway, there was a 3-mile long parked series of intermodal rail cars. And some of you might live in more rural areas, remember seeing boxcars and other types of cars parked everywhere. It was in the news, and of course that's starting to come back. And the thing about the railroads that's nice to know is they were actually making a rebirth before the recession hit, which was a good thing. They are more fuel efficient, at least per ton mile. They have lower emissions as a result. Usually they're lower cost, not always. But on the other hand, they were almost at max capacity before the recession hit, which means as we come back out of the recession, we're going to see that impact their ability. And what happens to the trains, which doesn't necessarily happen to the trucks, is they slow down when congestion happens. If you recall the Olympics from just a little over a year ago, the BN basically speed dropped to men's speed skating, to give you a picture. Whereas the UP, on the other hand, dropped to women's snowboard half pipe. And that was the speeds at which they're dropping. And that will happen again, because there's only so much you can push on the rails. The other thing that we've seen is a huge growth over time in intermodal, which is a good thing. And we're also seeing, as you can see in the bottom graph, we actually can see where 53-foot trailers are now becoming the mainstream on the intermodal routes. The other thing that we do know, in fact, this was just out of the April 1st Journal of Commerce, is that prices are going to go up. Intermodal is going up at least 3 to 5%. Trucks are going to go up much higher than that, probably in the 5 to 10%. So expect that's going to have an impact. We've also, many of you probably thought boxcars were dead. Well, believe it or not, they're not. In fact, Murphy handles close between 9,000 and 10,000 rail cars a year. We're the second largest rail user behind Xcel Energy. I don't have coal trains, so I can't catch up. But boxcars are here to stay, and actually they're very efficient. If you think about it from a logistics standpoint, we can put 3 to 4 truckloads of product in one boxcar. Now, one of the things that we have as a challenge in this state, as well as all states, quite frankly, we're not that unique on that case, is that since the 70s, most developers did not put rail into new industrial developments. So you cannot easily get access to rail. You have to go to people like a Murphy. Why do you think we did it? Because we are a rail transload facility and things like that. But rail is back for certain industries. And it's actually been here for many, but it's actually taking a rebound, which is nice. So again, one of the things I want to show on this slide, look at the bottom graph. That is a graph from 1999 to 2008, right before the recession hit. If you're wondering why Warren Buffett bought the Burlington Northern Railroad, notice the correlation between the growth in the GDP and rail stocks. You think he knew something that some of us don't know? Notice the correlation. The economy goes up, which it's doing, and he bought a railroad, which it will follow the growth. How about the ocean guys who bring the stuff from overseas? Interestingly, during the recession, they got hit with 2 big things. One, they parked equipment all over the world. I had a picture at a former slideshow where there was over 100 ships parked in the outside of the port of Shanghai alone. They also had, being good businessmen, ordered new, bigger ships to come online. And of course, the recession hit, and all of a sudden, they started showing up in 2009, which added capacity at a time when they didn't need it. Now, you might say, well, why would they do that? Well, these are big ships. If you look at those little boats in those pictures, like the one on the upper right, and think of we're in that little dinghy, that is a big ship. They handle close to 14,000 TEUs. That's the Maersk, the largest ship in the world. And that's what they had coming online during the height of a recession. Good business decision, unfortunately, economic times. But what's really interesting is if you start to look at the literature again and read the news things, they are back ordering these things because the economy is picking up. So it's amazing how things change within a 2-year cycle. And so what's the lesson? We just never know what's going to happen. One of the things we do know, though, is that there is a container shortage, and that has impacted many people here in the Midwest. It started when the recession dropped, obviously, and with no business to really fill up boxes, the Chinese manufacturers who make most of them shut the plants down. So they were shut down for close to 18 months, which when the recession
slowly ebbed its way away. I'm not going to say we're over yet, to the point now where they can't keep up. Now that they're also adding these newer, bigger ships that will continue to come online, they will not have enough boxes to fill them up, which means that the priorities will go to the eastbound boxes going back to Asia to come back to the US. It will not be to the benefit of an exporter in the Midwest, which is the concern that we all have. Because it's a perennial issue for the industry of how do you balance import exports, and the boxes need to be somewhere. So we saw a big issue here in the Midwest in 2010, and it's only going to get worse for now. The other thing that the ship guys have done is when the oil crisis was high in 2008, they slowed their engines down to save fuel and become more efficient, and they have reinstituted that starting in 2010, and most of them say that that is their new business practice. So what does that mean to you and I? It means it adds between a minimum of a week to more likely 3 weeks more inventory in the system, which for some big shippers and receivers is a big deal. Now, since we have a river right outside the window here, we might as well at least notice that they do have an impact. Unfortunately, it's mainly in bulk commodities at this point, but one barge will handle 15 rail cars or close to 80 trucks. And I know this for a fact. We actually used to handle antifreeze that came up from Louisiana. We used to get 58 truckloads of antifreeze per barge, and I think we did that for a couple of years. I think we got 3 a year. And how antifreeze works, because it's a commodity, it's cheap, and it's basically can sit on a barge for 3 weeks coming up the river. But this is an area that we may want to not forget about, because if you look at the economics, there's no if, it's, ands, or buts. We can move freight cheaper and probably more environmentally on a barge. The question is, can the time legs to come this far north ever make sense? I doubt it, but it's something to consider. So again, our overview slide. And fuel prices. We all know what happened a couple of years ago, but just look at what's happened in the last year and a half. Prices alone for diesel, and again, diesel, I pick on diesel because that's what trucks use and railroads use. It's up 33% in just 12 months. Many of us have only started to realize this at the pumps with the scare in the Mideast, but it has actually been hitting the trucking industry for at least 12 to 18 months. And I think Tom Shell has probably hit it the best, especially with the firstborn. At some point, we're getting back to that point. And the thing that's interesting is the forecasts of the federal government have not been able to keep up. Notice the difference between their March 8th forecast and where we are today. We're significantly higher than where they thought they were going to be, and we haven't even begun to take into account in our forecast what's going on with some of the changes in the Middle East where some of the oil is. So it'll be interesting to watch the ride. This might put it in a better perspective. Notice how far, back in 12 years ago in 1999, we used to be able to drive a truck from the Carolinas all the way up into Canada on $500. Notice where we are today. And notice how it continues to drop. It has dropped over the last 12 years. This probably says it better than anything. You can't go as far because of the cost. And of course, we know that oil is very strategic in the sense that it has choke points around the world that we have to worry about. And we also know that the Chinese economy, which has been in the press for years, has grown and continues to need oil just like our economy does and did as we were growing. And you can see here the difference between when they were self-sufficient and now they're a major player buying oil, which is, of course, putting pressure on it. And so, no ifs, it's, ands, or buts, fuel prices are going up. They would have gone up no matter what, in my eyes. Even though the Middle East has got people scared, it still was coming up. And so smart logistician supply chain folks are trying to figure out what is that going to mean to them when it gets back up to 2008 levels. I think we're going to probably start to get some serious talk in the next decade or so about the Class 5 railroads actually maybe seeing a transcontinental one merge. I don't know why the federal government would say antitrust, because you basically have two western ones and the rest are in the east. So we might actually see that. One of the things that we cannot forget at the local level, however, is that as the major railroads over the last 20, 30, 40 years basically consolidated and grew to their new levels, They basically gave up the backyard. So we need to keep those regional folks, those local, what they call short lines, like the Minnesota Commercial is just one example in Minnesota. There's only a couple of them. And you can kind of see their system there around the Twin Cities and up into even St. Cloud, close to St. Cloud. These folks are what give our businesses the ability to touch into the big Class 5s that eventually get us to the world. We can't forget what these guys do, and sometimes we do forget them because they don't necessarily run the fanciest equipment, and that sometimes they make us stop at stop signs as they go by and things like that. So just keep it in the back of your mind. We're seeing more and more mode shifting. Obviously the air guys, believe it or not, are back, but just months ago, a lot more went to ground or ocean. Intermodal's going, we're seeing some things actually go to boxcar, truckloads going intermodal big time, and et cetera. And this graph here shows just the big shift over the last 2 years alone between rail to truckload, just to give you an idea. Obviously the economy helped, but fuel prices will also continue to push. But again, we're going to run into capacity constraints on the intermodal at some point in the near future. Now, let's talk about some global trends. Global is complicated because if the world was a little different and the continents hadn't kind of shifted or drifted, as they say in geology, it wouldn't be such a problem. We could build a bridge between continents. But no, we can't do that. And you know what? Some days are just not the same as others. This guy took a quick right turn, and it just, it's not as easy as it looks. And then, of course, there are those pesky pirates that we hear about. And this is a map of all the pirate activity for 2010. There's a website you can go to, and you can literally track it by the day, and it shows where the activity is. One of the reasons I like to show this, especially to students, is that everybody's worried about the Somali pirates, but the ones that are really dangerous and have been for years are the ones in the Straits of Malacca by Thailand and Indonesia, because they've been there for hundreds of years. But what has happened with offshore? One of the things is we've seen distribution patterns change over the last 20, 30 years, especially, our parents lived in a different world. Our parents, if you think about it, lived in a world, if you look at the map at the bottom, the one on the left, that was the world we as kids grew up with. Some of you may not have been born, but most of us were kids. And over the last 30 years, 40 years, we have watched what used to be a domestic-oriented production model now shift into an import-export model, which is shown on the right, which is primarily import. And what has that done? It is obviously, with manufacturing has moved overseas. In some cases, we've got more efficient. But it's also meant, since products have gone overseas, distribution networks have become very different and much more critical. There's more warehouse distribution space than we ever had, and the inventory levels for the industry are generally higher because of it. As a result of it also, this country developed what's known as land bridges to handle freight, especially coming from Asia, which would land on the West Coast ports and work their way across by train, usually intermodal, to the central and into the East Coast. What's interesting, over the last 10 years, and it picked up acceleration in the last 3 years, was that magic line that used to be all the way over to the East Coast has now been moving to the west, as you can see in the diagram. So it's the all-water route has gotten to be cheaper. And you might say, well, how do you go all water? Well, you go through the Panama Canal, which in 2014 will see a major rebirth with the expansion that'll be done in 2014 that'll take ships nearly twice the size it can currently take. So all of the East Coast ports and the Gulf ports have been getting ready for this major change. Again, one of the slides I showed a second ago showed 25% of imports have already gone through the Panama Canal just a few years ago. It will probably go up. The interesting thing, however, in the last few months, actually in the last 6 months, if you want to go that far, is with the slow steaming combined with the rates that the intermodal guys have tried to generate business away from the ocean carriers has actually pushed that line back east again, which is surprising. How long it's going to stay there, nobody knows, but it'll have a play on how product is moved. There's a lot of competition as to where else we can go. People are looking at the Mexican ports. Obviously, Prince Rupert, which is up in Canada, has a wonderful port. It's 2 days closer by ship, which is significant because that means a ship going to Los Angeles, Long Beach, is still on the water when actually the product can be in the Midwest. As you can see, their rail connections are absolutely fantastic. We also know that there's a lot of talk about the Northwest Passage opening up if things continue to get warm. We don't hear much about that lately with other things going on, but if it does, look at what it does for the Europeans who want the Northeast Passage open. We want the Northwest maybe, they want the Northeast, which is the basic same thing. But notice on the diagram on the right, if going from Yokohama to Rotterdam, it's 34% less miles to go if it opens up. Now, I'm not saying we're all in favor of global warming or any of that kind of stuff. I'm just saying if this happens, it'll have a significant bearing on the movement of product and the amount of energy used, carbon, et cetera. We've also seen over the past decade, well, actually the past decade or so, is as imports have picked up, the creation of inland ports. As you can see, the major cities that have rail connections and good highway access have become those inland ports to basically pull congestion off the ocean ports. We've also seen a lot of transloading occur at the ports because it's a lot cheaper to take 3 40-foot containers and put them into 2 53-foot trailers. And so there's a fair amount of that going on. As you can see, close to 30% of it was done last year. We're also seeing some of the ocean carriers finally saying, you know what, those boxes you guys use, they're pretty valuable to us and we don't want you to just run all around with them. So we're going to charge you a fee. And that's having some interesting ramifications. We may see short sea shipping. Don't ask me to say that 3 times in a hurry. But who knows? It's very big in Asia and Europe. Whether we'll go to this level of detail, I doubt it. But who knows? You just never know. Supply chains are complex. Here is what an iPad supply chain looks like. And again, you can look at it, the order fulfillment's only 12 days, 18 hours, and 8 minutes. Now I know with the disruption in Japan right now, that's got a problem, but these are very fast, busy, complicated strategies. And of course, one of the things the Wall Street Journal looked at a couple of years ago when the oil had hit its peak was, well, how long can we afford to maintain production facilities in Asia versus Mexico? And I think that's really the lingering thing to keep in the back of your mind, because I think we're going to begin to see more and more near sourcing, and I keep getting pressure to keep moving faster. So we will. So total landed cost has become far more important. Models have been looked at to say, okay, what should we do in the US versus Mexico, Asia over time? As you can see on the left, everything was done in Asia. When they put in the new oil prices, and this happened to be in 2008, notice how Asia almost fell off the chart. Mexico picked up most of it. Even the US picked up a lot. The same thing was done in a different study that showed the shift. People are talking about actually coming back to America to do manufacturing, which is kind of exciting. But we got to remember that transportation is going to be at capacity. Trucks have got issues and rail can only grow so fast, and we're still going to have an issue. So let's talk about quickly a couple trends domestically. We know the big box guys have had a major impact on distribution patterns in the United States. They don't have any room in the stores, so the stuff has to become frequent and in smaller orders. However, it's interesting, have you been reading lately how Walmart, Best Buy, and Target have all said we're going to go away from the big box because Amazon's cutting into our business? It's interesting, so watch that trend. We even have Christmas sales officially now in July. So don't ever worry about being too late or too early. With the retail, with internet, we have no idea where the orders are coming from anymore, which plays havoc. We also know that kids are on the internet earlier and are shopping earlier because we think they're born to buy. And of course, how do we want it? We want it, and when do we want it? There is not even in that picture of 10 Coke cans, just plain old Coke. And interestingly enough, the Daily Stat ran a very interesting statistic a couple months ago. And UPS has responded. It is cheaper to ship your luggage by UPS than it is to give it to the airlines anymore. Who would have imagined? It's crazy. Now, we're going to see most of the big stuff continue to happen on the coast, especially when you think about where 60 to 70% of the US population tends to be in that area I've got encircled in black. That's where the action is. We're seeing more and more people talk about a change from the tradition of 3 to 5 distribution centers to cover the entire United States, North America, to possibly up to 6 to 10 locations. And you might say, well, why are they doing it? Because one of the reasons they've been looking at it is because the fuel price alone begins to suggest, believe it or not, that more is less. In other words, more distribution locations is cheaper than having just a few. The numbers are here on the slide. The other thing that they're doing is they're looking at, well, okay, if I have so many distribution centers and it's more efficient, how can I tweak it to deal with the carbon issue, which is the whole, sustainability movement that a lot of folks on Wall Street are going to come back to when the recession begins to subside. And in this particular scenario, you'll notice they added 2 more distribution centers. They only increased cost 1.6%, but they decreased carbon by 11%. How many CEOs are going to say no when they have to face Wall Street with their sustainability report? We are going to see this continue to ripple, and it's going to be very interesting to watch. So look at how we went from, in this scenario, 2 DCs, 4 to 6 because of carbon. We're going to see more cross-docking and consolidation. And let's drop that one. And I just want to remind you that when trucks, and rail has already made it difficult, except for our short lines, so don't forget our short lines, but when trucks, because they're going to get hard to get a hold of, and when a driver has the option, and this is what happened back in 2008, it's going to happen again, unfortunately, when a driver unloads in the Twin Cities where most of the freight goes, he's going to be given the option of a dispatch that's going to say, do you want to go to Timbuktu, and pardon my expression, or outstate Minnesota, you can call it Timbuktu, anything you want, which could be 100 plus miles away. It's going to take you 3-4 hours to drive there and back. It's going to be an hour to load, or you can pick up a load in the Twin Cities. You can be done in 2 hours and on your way, making money. That's the problem. It's pure economics. And so it's just something for you guys to wrestle with. So with that, I will open it up for questions, and I apologize for the speed.
Taking questions, just a reminder that we are filming the Q&A. So what that means is when you get the microphone, you're not going to hear the echo in the room. The microphone is for the video recording. So speak loud enough for us all to hear your question, but just know that you're not going to hear it through the system. So do we have any questions for Richard on this very thought-provoking presentation?
Don't make the video make you nervous now.
Good morning, Richard. One of my major concerns with your presentation was that last slide that you put up, and you had put it up earlier, and that showed companies wanting to relocate into the metro area and out of greater Minnesota.
It wasn't that they wanted to, it's they were left with no option.
I get it. And that's what concerns me, is that forcing those decisions creates 2 problems. Greater congestion and thus more problems in the metro area, and a greater Minnesota that's hurting for their economies suffer because there are no jobs. So in your mind, what kind of vision can you help this group with that that can steer us back towards keeping those jobs out in the greater Minnesota and making the opportunities greater for your logistics?
Yeah. I wish I could answer that question, Doug. I wouldn't have raised it if I had an easy answer, because those companies that came to us, and I'm sure there are other companies like us that had similar stories, they didn't know what to do. I mean, they've got products, they're priced right and everything, and if they can't get a truck to move it, it doesn't do you much good to make it. I don't know what the answer is going to be. Obviously, they have to pay more, but that doesn't help. That might mean they have to charge less because they got to build in the transportation. I agree it's going to add congestion, absolutely, back down into the cities. I don't know. Maybe John, I know John from the Minnesota Trucking Association is in the audience, if he had any thoughts, but I don't know. It's something that I laid it out because I wanted you guys to wrestle with it. It's an issue, and it will not go away.
Before John asks his question, if you could give your name and your organization before you ask your question, that would be great. So that was Doug Weijar with WSB Associates and the Central Minnesota Transportation Alliance.
John Houselot, Minnesota Trucking Association. Richard, you said it just in passing, but I think it's a big piece, and I would like you to elaborate a bit. You said money's getting hard, and the observation, and we know this, we work together in the same industry, we are seeing banks being tighter with the money that they're lending at a time when fuel is going up, when lines of credit are even more important because you're advancing that on behalf of your customer to get that fuel moved. What are you seeing in terms of the trends of the ability to finance both operating and capital to do all these things, whether it's trucking or rail, or what are you seeing?
Well, I'm seeing the private market is getting better, quite frankly, even in the last 6 months for lending to businesses, including small businesses, so it's coming. I think the biggest issue related to this problem, I think, now that I think about it, Doug, is the issue that I breezed over, and that was that a kid who wants to drive a truck, for whatever reason, and it's not that bad of a job, can't do it until they're 25, 26 years old at a minimum. So what that means is you've got high school kids, again, who graduate from high school, are lost for a few years, not sure what to do, who knows what they're doing, and they can't go into a profession that desperately needs them. So the question that you guys could maybe wrestle with is, to solve some of the problem, is how do we help the insurance industry deal with that to lower the requirements? It's an insurance industry requirement, if I'm correct. John, yeah. It's not a federal requirement. It's purely insurance. And that is a problem, because you have this whole boatload of kids who can't drive for a living yet. And don't forget, the railroads are going to have the same problem that we're talking about trucks. They already can't find enough engineers to drive the trains. So it's these two industries, which impact just about everything we move, is where the issues are.
Other questions for Richard? We covered a lot of ground. You must have been, oh, back here.
My wife said all the groceries prices are going up. That's because of the trucking and rail industry, right?
I would say that it's a combination of the logistics as well as the, even fuel goes into fertilizing, don't forget. Yep.
You could say your name and where you're from.
Jeremy Mathiasen with Bonus Joe Engineering. You pointed out some good points about the rail and the benefits that it has. We tend to see a lot of rail being taken away, or not a lot, but that seems to be the trend. I see more being taken away than added. Is that true in Minnesota and nationally, that it's trending towards less rail out there, or is it growing as well? Other than the light rail we see, it seems like things are going away more than coming in.
Yeah, I think that's true, because again, when you looked at the big Class 5 guys, they have basically abandoned the backyards, the local areas, and they've been doing that for a long time. And so really we're left with what is the capabilities of the short line railroads, like the Minnesota Commercial, the Progressive down south. I can't think of the other 2 or 3 because I don't use them. But those are the lifebloods for most of us to get access to the rail. Now I've also got access on the UP and the PN, but that doesn't mean everybody else does. And that's the issue, because let's say, to go back to Doug's issue, a question is, if a manufacturer wanted to use rail, which might make economic sense. Now, and let's talk boxcar. They may not have service in that plant in outstate Minnesota. We have a customer up in the northern area in the paper industry. They have traditionally shipped rail cars to us, and we ship something back to them so that they don't lose those rail cars, believe it or not. The other thing they ship down to us is because they can't get the service up there. When they get a hot order that has to go out either rail or truck, they can't get it from up there. So they've just for years been doing this. But it's an expensive issue. But rails, it can play a part. Does that mean that every building that has an industrial function should have a rail siding in it? I don't think we're going to go back to those days. It's just too expensive. So I think realistically, from a planning standpoint, I think we need to support the ones that are good and and allow them to have access where they can make it.
Bill?
Bill Towell, I'm representing the Minnesota Council of Airports as well as the St. Cloud Regional Airport. Where does air fit into this whole thing? I know, we talk about multimodal and it's a lot. I mean, what we're talking about right here, I think, is mostly truck and rail. I mean, things that generally aren't going to get on an airplane. But about 10 years ago, there was that cargo study that was done that talked about a regional distribution center. I think the latest on that was it was a little bit closer to Rosemont than anywhere else, and obviously the offshoot to that would be that there would need to be an airport close that could handle whatever the shipping is. And I know part of what's going to drive this is going to be the UPSs and the FedExes. I mean, the major companies that do this kind of thing. But maybe where could they fit into this role of even this carbon footprint thing of maybe keeping some trucks off the road and maybe lessening congestion and those kind of things down to these major metro areas?
Well, I would have thought, based on what I was watching during the recession, that air was going to have a tough time bouncing back. Believe it or not, they bounced back far faster than the other modes, which surprised a lot of us. Part of it was because some of the higher value products couldn't get here fast enough to meet the rebound because the inventories had been dropped so low. The only thing I can think about when I think about from our competitive standpoint as Minnesota, I think we have to remember Minnesota is not the center of the universe for distribution. I wish it was as a private business, but it is not. And one of the things we struggle with as a result, and I think this hits the air guys too, is Chicago a bigger hub? Is Kansas a bigger hub? Obviously Columbus, now we're getting a little further away. How much freight's going to come here that can't get here overnight? And I think that's the challenge that the Rosemont ideas have had. Also the cost of supporting that. The question has always been, there is private business already doing all that stuff. Do we really need to have government get in on the act? So I think that's one of the big questions I have is air is expensive. There's no if, it's, ands, or but. It's not efficient from a fuel standpoint compared to the other modes. It's only good for certain products. My guess is, again, as fuel prices come up, as they did in 2008, the guys were shifting away from air freight as fast as they could because they couldn't afford it.